If you walk through England long enough, you start to notice something strange. Kings are everywhere. They're on the coins rattling in your pocket, staring at you with that judgmental, I own your ancestors squint. They're on statues, on plinths, and carved into architecture of buildings that look like they were designed specifically to make you feel small. Their faces are etched into stone as if the stone personally owes them money. Queens, on the other hand, queens tend to vanish. Which is odd when you think about it, because some of them had a much shorter relationship with the concept of vanishing than they would have preferred. Take Henry VIII, a man who married 6 times, ruled like a thunderstorm with a crown, and left behind a trail of paperwork, religious chaos, and emotional wreckage so wide you can still trip over it 5 centuries later. Everyone remembers the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, the end, divorced, beheaded, survived. It's nice, it's catchy, it sounds like something you'd skip rope to on a playground. But what it doesn't tell you is what happened after the rope stopped turning, after the crowns came off and their time had passed, after the politics stopped pretending to be romance. Because here's the uncomfortable question nobody puts on the souvenir mug. Where are they now? Where did history put their remains? And maybe more importantly, what does that final real estate say about how useful they were once they stopped breathing? In the Tudor world, you weren't buried based on who you loved. You were buried based on how much of a mess you left behind for the next person in line. Henry VIII did not just marry 6 women. He processed them. In the eyes of the Tudor state, a queen was less of a person and more of a biological industrial complex. Her job was to produce a male heir, stay quiet during banquets, and look radiant in heavy velvet while her husband decided which of his friends to reach a final sentence with that Tuesday. When a queen failed, or simply lasted too long, the system had to find a way to file her away. Burial is not just about respect. In the 16th century, burial was the ultimate Yelp review. It was the final status symbol. Who gets a shrine that glows with candlelight? Who gets heavy marble slabs? And who gets quietly shoved into a hole in the ground because the king has a date on Thursday and doesn't want to deal with the logistics of their passing? Let's start with Catherine of Aragon, the queen who wouldn't move. Catherine was Henry's first wife, which means, by default, she was the longest-running administrative headache. They were married for over 20 years. In Tudor terms, that's not a marriage. It's a geological era. She was Spanish royalty, the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, the people who funded Columbus. She wasn't just a queen, she was a superpower in a bodice. But biology is a cruel auditor. Her failure to provide a surviving male heir turned her from the Queen of England into a very expensive piece of furniture Henry didn't want in his living room anymore. When Henry restructured the entire Church of England just to get a divorce, the ultimate "it's not me, it's the Pope" move, Catherine was demoted. They called her the Princess Dowager of Wales. It was history's way of saying, please stop sitting in the good chair. You're technically just the help now. She passed in 1536 at Kimbolton Castle. She wasn't surrounded by the court. She was isolated, sick, and likely suffering from a severe affliction, though at the time rumors of a toxic substance were the standard Tuesday gossip. When they opened her up for a post-mortem, the gravedigger found something black and hideous attached to her heart. Modern doctors say a secondary illness. Tudor gossip said Henry's temper finally turned into a physical toxin. Catherine was buried in Peterborough Cathedral. But look at the paperwork. She wasn't buried as a queen. She was buried as a dowager princess. It was the posthumous middle finger. Henry even refused to pay for a monument that matched her status. To this day, people leave pomegranates on her grave, her personal symbol. It's a quiet rebellion that has lasted 500 years. In the 1920s, Mary of Teck was so annoyed by the lack of queenie recognition that she ordered the banner above the tomb to finally reflect Catherine's true title. It only took 4 centuries for someone to fix the typo. Henry, by the way, didn't bother attending the service. He was too busy planning a joust to celebrate his new freedom, because nothing says "I'm over my ex" like falling off a horse in shining armor while wearing a yellow outfit to celebrate her passing. Then we have Anne Boleyn, the queen who is taken apart. If Catherine was a long-term headache, Anne was the migraine that changed the world. She was the reason for the break with Rome, the woman Henry upended an entire civilization for, only to decide 3 years later that he'd rather have her head on a plate than her feet under his table. Her final sentence was carried out on May 19, 1536. Henry, ever the gentleman, imported a specialist swordsman from St. Omer because a standard axe was apparently too low rent for the woman he used to write love letters to. After the sword did its work, the bureaucracy of the end took over with staggering inefficiency. There was no coffin prepared, no state funeral, no mourning period. They found an old elm chest, originally meant for holding arrowheads, and shoved her remains into it. She was buried under the floorboards of the chapel of St. Peter inside the Tower of London. It wasn't a tomb, it was a storage unit for political failures. For centuries, people walked over her without a second thought, the stone worn smooth by boots of guards and the occasional curious tourist. But wait, if you think Anne's story ends with a box of arrowheads, you don't know the Victorians' obsession with digging up the past. In 1876, Queen Victoria decided the chapel in the tower was looking a bit shabby. It was damp, the floor was uneven, and the ghosts of the transgressors were starting to affect the property value. When they pulled up the floor stones, they didn't just find dust, they found a chaotic, tangled mess of bones. The tower wasn't just a palace, it was a recycling bin for the people the crown was done with. Anne wasn't alone down there. She was piled in with the people who had helped orchestrate her fall, and the cousins who would later follow her to the block. The post-mortem report from 1876 describes finding a female skeleton with a delicate frame and a slender neck. They found the remains of a woman who was clearly 25 to 30 years old. They think it was Anne. But because the Tudors treated the remains like unwanted mail, the parts were all mixed up. They put her in a new lead box and gave her a marble tile. But in reality, she was still just part of the plumbing. The most famous woman in the 16th century is currently sharing a basement with the people who lied about her in court. Next came Jane Seymour, the one who did her job. Jane is often called the lucky one, which is a very dark way of saying her passing came before Henry could find a reason to end her life. She married Henry just 11 days after Anne Boleyn's final sentence. Talk about a quick turnaround. Jane gave him a son, Edward. Then, 12 days later, her body gave up. Henry was generally distraught, or at least as distraught as a narcissist can be when he loses his favorite piece of equipment. He wore black for months, something he didn't do for his parents, mind you. Jane was given a full Queen's service, the works. She was buried in the royal vault at St. George Chapel in Windsor. When Henry eventually met his end, bloated and decaying, he asked to be placed right next to her. It was the only time Henry showed any interest in a permanent roommate. He wanted to spend eternity with a woman who didn't give him any backtalk and produced the correct heir. When the vault was opened in 1813 to move another set of remains, the workmen noticed Henry's coffin had actually burst open. The king had become so filled with decomposition gases that he effectively expanded in slow motion over 3 centuries. Jane, meanwhile, was perfectly intact in her lead casing. Even in the end, she was the only one who could keep it together around him. The irony of Henry being a hot mess in the afterlife while Jane stayed perfectly preserved is the kind of dark humor the universe excels at. Then we have Anne of Cleves, the one who escaped. History calls her the Flanders mare, a nickname Henry gave her because he found her physically repulsive. He claimed he couldn't do his duty because she had evil smells and sagging skin. This was coming from a man who at the time had a leg ulcer that could be smelled from 3 rooms away. The ego is a powerful hallucinogen. Anne of Cleves was smart. When Henry asked for an annulment, she didn't fight. She didn't cry. She said, "Where do I sign and can I keep the jewelry?" Henry was so relieved she didn't make a scene that he gave her a massive settlement. Several castles, including Hever Castle, the former home of Anne Boleyn, and the title of the king's beloved sister. She outlived Henry, she outlived his son, she outlived his next 2 wives. Her time finally ended as a wealthy, independent woman in 1557. She is buried at Westminster Abbey. It's a modest tomb, tucked away near the high altar. She's the only wife buried in the Abbey. She didn't get the king's heart, but she got the best zip code in London. If you visit her today, you'll notice her tomb is decorated with memento mori and a set of carved lion heads. It's a quiet, sophisticated way of saying, I survived the lion, and I'm still here. Now we hit the peak of the strange, Catherine Howard. She was Anne Boleyn's cousin, barely 19, and effectively a child thrown into bed with a dying, paranoid giant whose legs smelled like a sewer. Her final sentence was carried out for transgression in 1542 after being caught in a game of hide the courrier with Thomas Culpeper. Like Anne, she was scrubbed from the record. She was taken to the same chapel, St. Peter, and put under the same floor. But here's the mystery. When the Victorians did their big Dig Up the Queens project in 1876, they found Anne, they found Lady Jane Grey, they found the Duke of Monmouth, but they couldn't find Catherine Howard. They found some bones that might have been a young woman, but they were so fragmented, so visceral in their decay, that the team couldn't make a positive ID. One of the most famous queens in history might not even be under her own marker. Because the chapel had been renovated multiple times and the Tudors weren't exactly big on permanent markers for those who faced a final sentence, she might have been moved and tossed into a common pit. Or she might have been 6 inches to the left where the tourists stand. History didn't just end Catherine Howard, it misplaced her paperwork. And then there is Catherine Parr, the survivor. She was the nurse, the intellectual, the woman who managed Henry's final foul-tempered years. She outlived him, married the man she actually loved, Thomas Seymour, and then met her end after childbirth a year later. She was buried at Sudley Castle in Gloucestershire. But buried is a loose term. During the English conflict, the castle was trashed by parliamentarian troops. The chapel was turned into a rabbit warren and storage shed. Her grave was lost for centuries. When it was finally rediscovered in 1782 by a man named John White, he didn't just find a grave, he found a time capsule. When they opened her lead coffin, Catherine Parr's remains were perfect. Her skin was still white, her eyes were still recognizable. She had been naturally preserved by the lack of oxygen in the lead. So naturally, the locals did the most 18th century thing possible. They left the coffin open so people could come by and poke at her. Some people even cut pieces of her shroud as souvenirs. By the time they finally put her back, the exposure to air had caused her to rot instantly. She went from pristine remains to a pile of brown dust in a matter of weeks. Today, she rests in a beautiful Victorian tomb, but inside, she's just an administrative error made of bone and regret. During one of the many times she was dug up, a local man actually cut off a lock of her hair. It's still on display at Sudley Castle. It's a bright, vibrant red, a reminder that even after the flesh fails, the DNA of the Tudor era refuses to go gray. If you're enjoying these strange, half-lost corners of history, consider subscribing. The vault opens twice a week, and there are no guided tours here, only case files. Stay for the truth, even if it's only truth-ish. And if this story was about how power treats women like disposable architecture feels familiar, wait until you see what happens when royal families start treating bloodlines like a closed experiment. Because when you're obsessed with where the remains are buried, you start getting obsessed with who the remains belong to. When you spend centuries trying to keep the good blood pure, you don't end up with gods, you end up with porcelain curse. A world where the jawbones don't fit and the minds don't work, and the empires crumble because nobody thought to look outside the family tree. That's a story called The Porcelain Curse, the tragic secret of pure bloodlines and dark history of royal family dynasties. And believe me, it makes Henry's floorboards burials look like a 5-star hotel. So what's the pattern here? It isn't just cruelty, it's utility. The Tudor court was a machine. If you gave the machine what it wanted, a son, you got the royal tomb in Windsor with the gold leaf and the chanting monks. If you didn't cause paperwork and stepped aside quietly, you got a dignified corner in Westminster. If you embarrassed the king or challenged his ego, you faced a final sentence and a box of arrowheads under a chapel floor near the dungeons. Burial in the Tudor world was the final administrative act. Jane Seymour is treated like a saint because she solved the king's problem and then exited the stage before she could become a person with opinions. Catherine of Aragon is a technicality, a queen who was demoted to a princess because she was too stubborn to pass when it was convenient. The others, they're just inventory. Items that were used, broken, and then filed away in whatever drawer was empty at the time. Even Henry himself didn't get the end he wanted. He spent decades planning a massive 3-story bronze and gold tomb that would have made the pharaohs look modest. It was never finished. His children were too busy fighting over religion to pay the contractors. He ended up shoved into a temporary vault in Windsor that was supposed to be a stopgap solution while they finished his monument. 500 years later, he's still in the temporary spot. History is a filing cabinet that caught fire and was reorganized by people who didn't speak the language. History likes to tell us that the past is full of grand romances and shining crowns. It leaves out the filing system. It leaves out the part where someone decides whether you get a monument or you get a patch of stone people walk across without noticing. It leaves out the smell of the lead and the sound of the shovels hitting the box of arrowheads. These were the wives of Henry VIII. This is where they ended up. And this is Truthish, where things are mostly true and always strange. Thanks for watching.